Combat can be a lot of fun in Eternal Strands, but it can also be pretty frustrating if you don't know some of the essential tips or master some of the game's basic mechanics. So after completing the game and collecting pretty much everything it has to offer, I'm going to give you some of my essential combat tips, including the best magic abilities, most powerful weapons and armor, tips for harvesting strands, and a lot more. And if you're enjoying Eternal Strands as much as I am, be sure to give this video a like and let's jump in. Now early on in the game when you don't yet have all the magic and you're still trying to find the best gear, the first and most important skill you need to master is the ability to parry. Using the sword and shield, you have the ability to parry enemy attacks. Not only is this great to avoid taking damage, but the first hit after a successful parry will deal an increased amount of damage. For larger enemies, especially the ones with shields, a successful parry will also stun them, leaving you a decent window where you can charge in and deal even more damage. And for archers and other enemies with ranged attacks like fireballs, a successful parry will deflect the projectile back in their direction. Now I've actually found the timing on the parry to be pretty forgiving, and with a little bit of practice, it shouldn't take you too long to master. But the actual movement for the parry is Bryn essentially swatting away the attack with her shield. So you want to time it to press block right when you start to see the swing of the enemy going forward. And if you look really closely, you'll see a spark of light show up on the enemy's weapon right when they're about to lunge forward. That should be a good visual indicator to get ready to parry. And most enemies telegraph this in advance and have a decent windup, so there shouldn't be too many surprises. Now when it comes to the crafting system in Eternal Strands, there's a lot of flexibility, but that can also make it pretty daunting, especially early on. But it's actually a lot more straightforward than the game makes it out to be, so let me run through some tips that I've found pretty useful. Now in order to craft new weapons and armor pieces, you'll first need to discover the schematics located throughout the different parts of the map where you see a hammer icon. Once you've located the schematics, you can take it back to Solace Forge to craft. Each item will require a combination of different raw materials that you collect out in the world, and that combination of materials will not only determine the stats for that piece, but also the color. Now with so many different options and combinations to choose from, you can spend a lot of time here, and I know I certainly did, trying to find the perfect combination. But here's why you really don't need to overthink it. At any point in the game, you can head back to Sola and reforge an item. So as you progress through the game and pick up better, more rare resources, you can swap it out. This also gives you an opportunity to craft weapons and gear just to test it out and see if you like it with whatever resources you have available. And if you decide you do like it, then you can reforge it with better resources to get better stats later on.
Worse than materials, I'd say.
Now you can also dismantle any item at Solace Forge at any time to get all of the raw materials back for that item. This is also true when you reforge an item. The original materials just go right back into your inventory, so there's no penalty at all for reforging and dismantling your armor and weapons at any point. In that way, I almost think it's better to think of the materials in the game as more like items you equip to your weapons and armor rather than as pure crafting materials, because the resources can be equipped and basically unequipped at any point without actually losing the resource. Now I'd also recommend upgrading Casmyn's Cavern to its max level as soon as you're able to. Not only does this give you additional inventory, but you'll also get the ability to trade camp supplies and turn them in for higher rarity items. This can be an easy way to get some of those legendary items without having to farm. Or if you just need a specific upgrade mat and don't know where to find it, you can just trade in some lower level items to pick it up. Eventually, you'll also have the ability to trade in camp supplies in order to modify the weather in a given area. This can be really helpful because having to trudge through an area with flash freeze or miasma can be pretty annoying. Now when it comes to weapons, the game has a lot of options, so let me share with you the ones that I found to be the most useful, and I'll show you exactly where you can pick them up. The Ice Sword and Shield, which you can get pretty early on, ended up being one of my favorite weapons mainly because of the Avalanche ability. This ability will send out a streak of ice that will not only deal damage directly, but also freeze an enemy in place. I like that this adds a little bit of a ranged option when in combat, and when dealing with multiple enemies, it gives you the ability to freeze one to focus on the other. Or you can just take advantage of one being frozen in place to deal the extra damage. But this attack also has a bit of height to it, so it can be a good option when dealing with some of the game's more annoying flying machines.
Probably wasn't that way before, Sarge.
Now you can find the Ice Sword and Shield pretty early on at this hammer item location at Upper Denevron, just outside of the Scholar's Walk. Now next up is the Kinetic Sword and Shield, which ended up being my favorite weapon in the entire game, and this is the first weapon that I ended up upgrading to its max level. It comes with the special Weaver Flares ability, which essentially gives you the ability to pick up and toss anything in the area. This one is incredibly fun to play around with and is useful when going up against pretty much any enemy in the game, especially when you're in a group. And upgrading it to higher levels lets you pick up even more things and throw them even further. Now unfortunately, this is one you won't really be able to pick up until the late game, but it can be found at the Institute, just north of expansion Cavern 36. Now there's a couple of two-handers I would also recommend picking up early, not only for the extra strength, but also for their magical abilities. And first up is the Ice Two-hander. This one has the Ice Slash special ability, which has a decent AoE attack that's capable of hitting and freezing multiple enemies at the same time. Similar to the Avalanche attack on the Ice Sword, an enemy that's hit by a blast of ice has the potential to get stuck. But instead of just one blast, this two-hander sends out 3 and has a nice little finisher at the end. And assuming the Ice Slash doesn't take out the enemy, you can use the residual pieces of ice to throw at them, so this gives you a lot of flexibility. Now this is one that you can pick up in the Bastion, right outside the Officer's Gate, Loom Gate, in the yard. But the two-hander that I like the best is the Kinetic Two Hander that comes with the Ascending Strike ability. This ability will launch an enemy up in the air, not only dealing damage by the hit, but will also give you a window to deal some additional damage in the air. I've also found that by staying locked onto the enemy, it'll keep you relatively close to them so you continue the attack on the ground. And as useful as this is for attack, I've found this to be an even better way to launch myself onto high ledges, or even scaling up a great foe, because the Ascending Strike doesn't use up any of your stamina. So if you're trying to save up as much stamina as possible so you can harvest a strand, you can first launch yourself up using the Ascending Strike. Now the Kinetic Two-hander is one that you can pick up pretty early in Upper Denevron, right outside the Spire Loom Gate. Now let's talk about magic, because I've experimented with all of the abilities, and while some of them are certainly fun to use, they might not be the most practical, and others are best used in combination with some other abilities. So let me tell you which ones I like the best. Your first ability, the Weaver's Grasp, is far and away the best ability in the game. No matter how good you are at the parry or how powerful your weapons are, there's still no substitute for just being able to pick up an enemy and yeet them right off a cliff. And I really like that you can also hold enemies up in the air for a pretty long time, because sometimes you're not near a cliff and you have to walk a while to find one. At higher levels, you'll also be able to grab and throw even bigger objects, and you're also able to grab a lot more things and throw them at much further distances, so this is definitely an ability I'd invest in upgrading as soon as possible. Now you can harvest strands for upgrading the Weaver's Grasp from the Redland Sledgeworm. This is probably one of the most straightforward Great Foe fights in the game, so I definitely recommend upgrading it as soon as you can. Now I also like to have a good fire spell handy just in case, and I've found the Drake's Breath to be the best of the bunch. This one gives you the ability to blast out fire, and upgrading it all the way to level 3, there's actually a bit of an explosion that you can get with that initial burst. You have to be pretty up close and personal for it to work, but when it does work, it can take out most enemies pretty quickly. Now in order to upgrade this one, you'll have to harvest strands from the Ash Peak Drake, which is another foe that I found relatively straightforward. You just want to make sure that in addition to hitting off all of the Drake's scales and the horns, you also damage one of the wings. This will keep him from throwing you off whenever you go in to harvest the strand. Now if you're looking for a good ice spell, I found the Frost Mine to be pretty useful. Not only is this a good way to inflict enemies with frost, which will allow you to deal additional damage, but it gives you another good ranged option, which I find to be a more powerful option than using the Frostbow. You can also pair the Frost Mine with the Weaver's Grasp to throw at enemies. Now in order to upgrade the Ice Mine, you'll have to harvest a strand from the Highland Ice Claw. This is another one that I found to be relatively straightforward, but if you're constantly getting thrown off before you're able to harvest the strand, you want to make sure that you're not only stripping the different scales from the bird, but also similar to the Drake, you need to damage one of its wings. Just be careful not to damage both wings, because if you do, the bird won't fly and you won't be able to expose the locus of power. Now later in the game, as part of the main story, you'll also get the Kinetic Stream ability. This ability will open up a tunnel that can launch you across distances and ended up being one of my favorite abilities in the entire game. It's great for launching yourself across buildings, especially if you're like me and you really like jumping across the rooftops. And this ends up being the best way to get on top of great foes to make harvesting a lot easier. Now this might be considered a bit of a spoiler, alluding to the final endgame boss, so if you don't want to know anything about the endgame, consider yourself sufficiently warned. But in order to upgrade the kinetic stream, you'll need to harvest from the Surgeborn Herald. Once you complete the game, he'll show up in various different areas just like the other great foes, and you'll have the ability to harvest his strand. Although I will say, harvesting the strand from the Surgeborn Herald is no joke. You'll have to break apart all of his weak points, and once his locusts explode, you won't be able to just go right in and harvest the strand, or you'll get thrown off.
I'm pulling you. Brace for it.
In order to harvest, you'll need to first freeze his free arm, the one without the sword, so that he can't throw you off, and then once frozen, you can move in for the harvest.
Another kinetic strand.
Alright, and those are my essential combat tips for Eternal Strands. If you enjoyed this video or learned something new, leaving a like would be much appreciated. And if you've got a combat tip to share, definitely leave it for me in the comments below. As always, thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.
Can't stretch the scroll on. Hold on.